The Chicago Bears have had a franchise-altering offseason, and many people believe that the Chicago Bears are one of the deadliest young teams in the NFL. Today, I want to talk about this Chicago Bears team and give you guys my opinion on where the Chicago Bears are heading. So the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to be breaking this down into two different segments. We're going to begin by talking about why the Chicago Bears might be the deadliest team in the NFL, and then we'll talk about the opposite of that, of why this team may not be the best team in the NFL. And at the very end, I'll finish it all up with my synopsis on the Chicago Bears. So as I mentioned, we are going to begin by talking about why I think this Chicago Bears team has the capability of being one of the better teams in the NFL. And the number one reason why I think this team has the capabilities of being that good, they have two top 10 picks. Going out there with the number 1 overall pick and the number 9 overall pick and having the ability to take two great players in this year's draft is a fantastic position this team is in. I think it's no secret that with the number 1 overall pick, they're going to be taking their franchise quarterback in Caleb Williams. I've been saying this from the very beginning. I think Caleb Williams is a fantastic prospect. He's been my number 1 quarterback in this draft class since basically last year. I think that Caleb Williams heading into this system with all the pieces around him is going to be a fantastic player to put in that spot. That's kind of like the less fun pick of the two because we all kind of know Caleb Williams will be the pick. It really gets more interesting with their second first round pick because this team has a lot of options for a lot of different positions that could potentially be filled. You could take potentially an offensive lineman with your first round pick to shore up the interior portion of the offensive line, mainly the center and right guard position. We'll talk about them in just a little bit. Or you could potentially take an edge rusher to add somebody alongside Montez Sweat. Or even if you're feeling a little bit crazy, you can maybe add another piece into the secondary, even though I do think the secondary is already pretty good. Again, we'll talk about this secondary in just a little bit. But all in all, there's a lot of different possibilities of what they can do with their top 10 pick. Recent reports and rumors have come out that they're interested in taking Byron Murphy out of Texas, which I think would be a slam dunk of a pick for them. I do think it is a little bit high, and taking him in the top 10 might be a little bit rich for me, but if there is a possibility that they could potentially trade back to, let's say, like the 16th overall pick and take a guy like a Byron Murphy, I think that would be fantastic value. This is a defensive line that could definitely use some work. Again, we'll talk about them in just a second, but adding a guy like a Byron Murphy or a Dallas Turner or a Jared Verse would be a fantastic piece to add to this defensive line. Unfortunately, this team does not have their second round pick, but honestly, it doesn't really matter in my opinion because you have two top 10 picks to go along with what is already a pretty set roster. But then in the third round, they're also going to be able to add another piece potentially to the offensive line or to the defense. The next thing I really love about this team, they have weapons on weapons on weapons. Last year and for the past couple years, this has been a team that has really struggled to find weapons to add alongside Justin Fields. And unfortunately for Justin Fields, the one year that he is going to be on a different team is probably the best year the Chicago Bears team will have when it comes down to their weapons. Offensively, they added DeAndre Swift, which honestly I don't really love, but when you look at the entire running back room, it's a fantastic group of guys. You have DeAndre Swift, who is more than likely going to be your change of pace running back, who's going to more than likely be your starter, to go along with the young Roschon Johnson, who I think will be more of your bruisier goal line back, who I think has a lot of potential to be a very good running back in this league. Then you have some other guys like Khalil Herbert and Travis Homer, who have been rotational players. Khalil Herbert a little bit more so than Travis Homer. Khalil Herbert will also be in your rotation of running backs, and I think all in all, having 3 guys in that running back position will only benefit all those guys to have a great year. Looking into the receiving room, this is where things get a lot more fun. You have DJ Moore, who obviously was your receiver 1 last year and probably will still be your receiver 1 next year. DJ Moore had a fantastic year last year with Justin Fields, and I think next year with a guy like Caleb Williams, who's much more of a gunslinger style quarterback, you're going to get even more production out of DJ Moore. Having him and adding a guy like a Keenan Allen, who's your number 2 wide receiver, is just going to make this receiving core ridiculous. Keenan Allen is, of course, one of the best receivers we've seen in quite some time out of the LA Chargers locker room. He's a versatile guy who you can play on the inside and on the outside, and you can expect decent production from him next year as well. Adding him next to DJ Moore and putting him next to Caleb Williams is just going to be such a fun receiving duo. I will say the receiver 3 position is a little bit more up in the air. Currently, Tyler Scott is slotted in there to be the starter, but I could also see somebody like a Velus Jones Jr. or a Colin Johnson potentially getting some snaps as that wide receiver 3 if they do not address it in this year's draft. I will say if they really want to get an offensive juggernaut, they could potentially take a Rome Odunze or a Malik Nabers or a Brian Thomas Jr. with their second first round pick. I think that's a little bit less likely because I think they might be gone at that point, but if a Rome Odunze is available, you might want to consider it. Looking into the tight end room, you obviously have Cole Kmet, and potentially they could take Brock Bowers as well, but I think Cole Kmet has shown enough of his ability to be the starting tight end next year. He's a very solid tight end. You don't think you really want to mess with that all that much. Next thing I really like about this roster is they are becoming one of the better young defenses in the NFL. Last year on the back half of the season, the defense actually became one of the better units out there. The secondary, which I talked about earlier, has transformed into one of the better young secondaries in the NFL. Tyreek Stevenson was really solid throughout the season, but especially on the back end of the year. I will say it kind of started off a little bit rough for the young guy, but after a while of getting used to the NFL speed, he got a lot better as the season season went on. They obviously kept Jalen Johnson, who's going to be their cornerback one of the future, and I definitely think that was the right decision. Kyler Gordon, who's more of your nickelback corner, definitely had an up and down past couple years, but last year, similar to the rest of the guys as the season went on, he definitely got better himself. And then you obviously have Jaquan Brisker and Kevin Byard, who are going to be your safety duo, and I think that safety combination is actually very solid. Kevin Byard is a little bit older, but he does provide at least a veteran presence in an extremely young secondary. Before he was with the Eagles, he was one of the better safeties out there in the league, so I definitely do think he's going to continue to be at least a solid safety prospect for this team. But all in all, with a defensive-minded head coach and potentially even more attrition coming in from this year's draft, this is going to be one of the better defenses in the NFL. Now, I will say it's not a defense that I think is flawless, but I do think it is a capable enough defense to get the job done. One of the last things I really like about the roster, and this is the only thing that I'm going to mention before I start talking about the opposite opinion of this, is that this is one of the younger teams in the NFL. Yes, they have some older guys like Keenan Allen, and I guess DJ Moore's a little bit older, but for the most part, this is a pretty young roster. You look at their quarterback, they're going to have a rookie quarterback. You look at their tight end, he's still pretty young. A lot of the pieces on the offensive line are very young. Guys like Tevin Jenkins and Darnell Wright are very young players. Defensively, you do have a couple of older guys, but then you have guys like Tremaine Edmonds, who has been in the league since 2018, but is only 25 years of age. You have guys like Montez Sweat, who are still pretty young. As I mentioned earlier, your secondary is a very youthful unit. And after you take your draft class in, you're going to have a young rookie quarterback, a young rookie offensive lineman, defensive lineman, somebody who's going to make this unit even more younger. So we're talking about a Chicago Bears team that, if they're not great next year, within the next 5 years or so, they're going to still be good because of how young they are. This is not a team that is full of a bunch of veterans and a bunch of really older players like, let's say, the Seattle Seahawks or the New Orleans Saints. This is a team that is extremely young and only going to continue to improve. But now let's move on to the opposite side of things of why people might not think this Chicago Bears team is prepared to be one of the deadlier teams out there. And the number one thing that I think this team does have going against them is their coaching staff. Obviously, their head coach is going to be Matt Eberflus next year, who's more of that defensive-minded guy, but I will say he hasn't really put together a good team in his tenure with the Chicago Bears. Now, I understand their idea of not wanting to fire him so that there is some level of continuity on this team, and to be honest with you, I do think that is the right move. This is a guy who has over 30 years of coaching experience, but I will say I do think the clock is ticking on him because this is the best team he's ever had with this Bears team, and there is pressure on him to at least perform next year, to at least be in the playoff realm. I'm not saying this team has to make the playoffs, but they have to at least be in the playoff bubble come late in the season. I think there's a lot of questions about what Matt Eberflus brings to this team, but I think there's also questions about what the other options out there, your offensive coordinator and your defensive coordinator, what can they do to elevate this roster, because there's a lot of talent on this team, and the last thing you want is a coaching staff that's going to be holding back your offense and your defense. As it sits right now, your offensive coordinator is Shane Waldron, who's been an offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks the past 3 years. Now, obviously, the Seattle Seahawks have not been like this championship contending team. However, they've had pretty solid offenses throughout their time. Obviously, Geno Smith has turned into one of the better offensive quarterbacks in the league, so I think if Shane Waldron can turn Geno Smith into a competent starter, I do think there's a very solid possibility that he could do the same thing with Caleb Williams. My one little knock on this hire is that I do think there are some better options on the table. I really would have liked to have seen this team go out there and take Cliff Kingsbury, because he does have a strong understanding of who Caleb Williams is and what his strengths are. But I will say, going out there and getting a proven guy like a Shane Waldron, who's also been in the league for quite some time, does make a ton of sense. I'm interested to see what schemes he decides to run, especially early on in the season as Caleb Williams is getting his feet wet into the system. But I do also like the idea of putting a young quarterback with an experienced offensive coordinator, so I do think that does make sense. Defensively, your defensive coordinator is Eric Washington, but again, your defensive coordinator is more than likely just going to be Matt Eberflus. You're going to run Matt Eberflus' system. Last thing I'll say about this coaching staff is, if this coaching staff does not win a lot of games, I expect a complete overhaul this next offseason. I think that if this team fails to make the playoffs, or fails to at least be a competitive team come late into the season, early January, late December, there's a very strong chance that Matt Eberflus will be coaching for a different team next year. So there's a lot of pressure on Matt Eberflus to be a productive coach, and I think that there's a lot of resources for him to be that productive coach. Next thing that does make me doubt this team in some ways is their super tough division that surrounds them. Obviously, the Detroit Lions have turned themselves into one of the best teams in the NFL. By the way, I'll have a Detroit Lions video coming within the next couple weeks. I think Detroit has the possibility to be one of the best teams in the NFL, if not the best team in the NFL. And whenever you have that team in your division, it's always going to be tough. Now, the one thing I will say is that unlike a lot of different divisions, I do think this is a division that regardless of how good the teams are, the games are still super competitive. Like, you can look at the Kansas City Chiefs division and you're going to know for a fact that the Broncos or the Chargers or the Raiders are more than likely going to lose to that Chiefs team. Whereas in this Chicago Bears division, it does seem like this is a division that is a lot more competitive. Hell, last year we saw the Green Bay Packers come out of nowhere to beat the Detroit Lions on Thanksgiving, despite the fact that Green Bay was looking down and Detroit was looking up. This is one of those divisions that regardless of how good or bad the teams are playing, it's still going to be a super competitive game, so either team can honestly win those games. But regardless of how I feel about the division, this is a super stacked division with other teams like the Green Bay Packers also playing like one of the best teams in the NFL. And with Jordan Love potentially getting a contract extension at some point this offseason, you're going to have to be facing up against the likes of Jared Goff and of course Jordan Love these next 5+ years. Jordan Love looked fantastic last year, and that Green Bay Packers team had a very good offseason, and I think they're going to have a very good draft to address any of their remaining issues. And then you have the Minnesota Vikings, who also have 2 first-round picks, and they're looking to be super aggressive to potentially get a quarterback in this year's draft. But even if they don't get a quarterback, they're going to have 2 first-round picks to add 2 very good pieces to what is already a pretty solid roster. It's hard to really say how I would rank this division in who's the best and who's the worst. I guess if I had to put it right now, I'd probably have it as Detroit, Green Bay, Chicago, Minnesota in that order. But honestly, I could see this division going in any way where it's even a possibility that Minnesota finishes with the first overall seed in this division. So regardless of that, I think this is such a tough division to even win, but I think it's going to be a tough division to maneuver as the season goes on because of how good the teams are becoming and how this division might be one of the best divisions in the NFL. So that could be a knock on the Chicago Bears team because obviously 6 of your 17 games are against this division. Last thing I will say, and it's a personnel issue that I have with this roster, is their defensive line needs a lot of improvements. As it's right now, I really only like one player on this defensive line, and that's Montez Sweat. I do think there are some young players on this defensive line like Gervon Dexter and Zach Pickens who can be rotational pieces, but as of right now, none of those guys really have a pass rush upside quite like a Montez Sweat does. Now again, they can dramatically fix that by taking a defensive lineman at some point in this draft, hopefully with their second first-round pick, because if you add a guy like a Byron Murphy or a Jared Verse or a Dallas Turner, I do think this does fix your issue. However, if this team does opt to rather go for a receiver or an offensive lineman or some piece maybe in the secondary if they want to stretch it that far, then I still think this defensive line has a lot of work to do. Regardless of that though, I don't think the defensive line being a bad unit overall makes me necessarily think that this team is going to be bad all of a sudden. I just think that personnel wise, this is probably the weakest unit of this team, but I do think it has a good chance of being a lot better come draft night. So that is both sides of the story, but where do I and where do you fall on this Chicago Bears team? Well, for you guys tell me in the comment section below. For me, I think this is a Chicago Bears team that has a ton of upside to be a fantastic team. Now, am I going to go out and go crazy and say they're going to win the division next year? Probably not. I think there needs to be a year of growing and maturing from your young quarterback and your young pieces, but I think if Caleb Williams can come in and be that generational quarterback we think he can be, this team has a lot of upside, and I do think this is one of the deadliest teams in the NFC and in the NFL in general. But again, you guys tell me, what do you guys think about this team? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.